In the not too distant past, I made this video about where the names of different Native American tribes came from. However, they were all tribes that lived on the Great Plains. Tribes you've probably heard of like the Lakota, also known as the Sioux, as well as the Cheyenne and the Comanche and others. But many people asked, where are some of the other tribes? Because there are a lot more Native American tribes, a lot of famous ones that we didn't hear in this video. So this video is how did Native American tribes get their names? Part 2, Southern Boogaloo, because in this one we're going to be looking at the tribes that lived further south than the Great Plains, and there's some big names coming up ahead. So one of the first that I want to look at are the Apache, who you've probably heard of. They're a famous tribe because they were one of the last tribes to give up. This is a picture of Geronimo, who is possibly their most famous leader, who continued to resist right up until the dawn of the 20th century. Now the first mention of the Apache comes from 1598 with a Spaniard called Juan de Oñate, and he was moving north on one of the Spanish expeditions from their bases in Mexico further north into America, and this is when we get the first reference in Spanish to a people called the Apache. Now it's probably from a Zuni word, which I'll cover a little bit later on, with something like Apachu, and it's thought that actually not the Apache but a different tribe, the Navajos, was meant by this word, which is a little bit strange because Navajos is Apachu in the Zuni language. It's the plural form of their name for that tribe. And the Navajo were also a tribe from a similar region to the Apache, and in fact they shared a similar language and a similar culture, even though they eventually became quite distinct. So it's a little bit confusing why they're calling this word Apache for this other group of people, when actually it was the Zuni's word for the Navajo, but it's possible that because of this shared language, the Spanish were confused by what it was. Another possible etymology and reason why it's meant for the Apache that we now associate with the Apache is that it comes from a Yavapai word, which is Apache. So something that this means is something like an enemy, the enemies. So again, a similar root to how the Utes named the Comanche, if you remember in the last video. A third one, but less likely, is that it comes from the Spanish word Mapache, which means raccoon. I'm not sure why they would name it after raccoons, and it seems less likely than the two of the native origin, but it is still a possibility. Now, interestingly enough, Apache in the 19th and 20th century in Paris, in Parisian French, came to mean something like an outlaw. This is because they'd been reading about the Apaches in like these dime store novels, and they became famous for their hostility and their raids and things like that in the American West, and so they started to associate the Apache with this kind of behavior, and that's why they called their gangsters after it. And of course later on the Americans named their attack helicopters the Apache helicopters after that same tribe, as they did with many other tribes. They called helicopters after them, like Chinook for example, or Black Hawk was a famous Native American chief. So Apache really has an awful lot of different meanings depending on the time, context and place. I'm going to pause for a second here to talk about today's video sponsor, which is a company called Blinkist. Now what Blinkist does is they make reading an awful lot easier. A lot of the time people ask me, Hilbert, how do you research your videos? I want to know more about this topic, and I say books are your best friend. But unfortunately, books can be quite long, and a lot of people also say, Hilbert, I absolutely hate reading, I don't have time for it, I've got things to do. So that's where Blinkist comes in. Now what Blinkist does is, instead of making you sit down and read an entire book, they actually condense it down into a 10 or a 15-minute summary, which you can read or even you can listen to. A lot of the time they have audio summaries of these books, so you can get the crucial information from these books in just a much smaller amount of time. So that if you're in the shower, or you're on your commute to work, or you just fancy a bit of reading, then you can use Blinkist as your new best friend to condense this information down and get it a lot faster. The summary that I'm going to recommend to you today is called The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. It's written by a Native American person himself. He's from the Ojibwe, so a tribe much further to the north than what we're talking about today. But it summarizes an awful lot of Native American history after Wounded Knee, after the end of the Indian War, so from 1890 to the present, which recently has become very, very relevant in the news, and it's something I'm going to be talking about in another video. So as you can see here, you've got an audio version. It's condensed down into a 13-minute read, and you can get that with your average subscription to Blinkist, along with an awful lot of other titles on history, religion, philosophy, self-improvement, and lots more. There is also a special offer that the first 100 people who go to www.blinkist.com/historywithhilbert will get full unlimited access for a week, and then if they decide to get full membership, it will be with 25% off. So check that out, the link is in the description, and thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. Now the Apache word for themselves is somewhat different, it's inde, and this again, and in a common theme, means just people. And you'll notice the similarities to the Navajo word in a second, because now I'm going to take a look at the Navajo. So remember that they kind of confused those two, the Spanish, when they came north into present-day New Mexico and that kind of area, when they will have interacted with these people. Now the Navajo are another famous tribe that lives in the southwest, in Arizona, in New Mexico, and some in Oklahoma now as well. It also should be noted that Navajo can be spelt with a H. The sound is often given as Navajo, but it depends on whether it's British English tends to spell it with a H, whereas American English and Spanish spell them with a J. And this is because it's a Spanish transliteration. And of course, in Spanish, it should be pronounced Navajo. But a lot of the time Americans will make the Spanish J sound like a jalapeno instead of a jalapeno and things like this. So they were first known by the Spanish as Apache de Navajo. So you can see the confusion between them. Here we literally have a term that uses the term Apache, so like Apache, and Navajo, so like Navajo, in the same term. And what this meant was something, it probably came from the Pueblo word Navajo. Now the Pueblo, I talked about them in a previous video as well, to do with the horses, because they were the ones that kind of facilitated the horses getting out from Spanish control and off onto the Great Plains, are a conglomeration of peoples in the southwest. And their word Navajo means something like cultivated field. So depending on our definition of Apache that I covered just now, you can kind of infer what this means. It's interesting that the name Navajo, because they took on farming, they learned it from the Pueblo peoples and became farmers, that Navajo, their word, was for large areas of cultivated land. It says something about their culture. Now Navajo then is the Spanish transliteration of this word from Pueblo, Navajo, which has the meaning of the large area of cultivated lands. So you can see again that Apache and Navajo, there's all these different meanings, and depending on the context, you have a different one. Now the Navajo word for themselves is Diné, so you can see it's related but not quite the same as the Apache word for themselves, Inde, and once again Diné just means people in the related language. So now let's take a look at Pueblo, and Pueblo is very interesting because it actually means something in a different language. Now the Pueblo are an interesting group. They're not actually one tribe, there's an awful lot of different tribes, and actually I know someone from Cambridge who's an archaeologist who has looked in depth at the Pueblo, so if you're interested in this, I could bring her on for an episode of the History with Hilbert podcast if she's happy to talk about this. Let me know in the comments below, but if you've heard of the Pueblo, it's probably about these amazing stone towns that they made from these kind of mud bricks that have lasted for, in some cases, for centuries, if not longer, on the same site, and that's why they became known by the Spanish word Pueblo, and Pueblo in Spanish means town. Now I should put a disclaimer in here because I mentioned this in a previous video and some Spanish speakers said yes, but Pueblo can mean different things, because while Pueblo is a town, the physical place, it also has another meaning of people or community. So if you say El Pueblo Español, you're talking about the Spanish people rather than the Spanish town. But I think it's likely that it came from Pueblo as in town because they built towns and they thought, hey, golly, the town people. I think that makes sense. So another term that you often hear in connection with the Pueblo is this one, Anasazi. And if you've ever watched Ancient Aliens, looking at you, then you'll definitely have heard this term because they fantasize about this an awful lot. Now I'm not going to be talking about the alien side of thing here, but actually about the etymology of Anasazi, because it's a really interesting one. And this is because Anasazi is actually a Navajo word. So the interesting thing is that you've got the Pueblo who give us the word Navajo, which is then taken into Spanish Navajo, which then goes back into English as Navajo. But then the Navajo were the ones that named one of these Pueblo groups, and they called them Anasazi. And what this means is something like ancient enemy, which is very interesting, and this is something the alien guys have kind of hopped on a lot as well with what this precisely means. But there is a whole debate in academia that has been had about this, and actually something that an expert on the Pueblo peoples in her book Ancient Pueblo Peoples said. Her name is Linda Cordell, about the name Anasazi, and I didn't know this before researching this, but apparently it's now not a term that we should be using because of its origin. And she writes that the name Anasazi has come to mean ancient people, although the word itself is Navajo, meaning enemy ancestors. The Navajo word is Anasazi. The Ana from enemy, while Sazi comes from ancestor. The term was first applied to the ruins of the Mesa Verde, which is one of these stone towns, one of these Pueblo sites, as they're called, by Richard Wetherill, a rancher and a trader who in 1888 to 1889 was the first Anglo-American to explore the sites in that area. Wetherill knew and worked with the Navajos and understood what the word meant. The name was further sanctioned in archaeology when it was adopted by Alfred V. Kidder, the acknowledged dean of southwestern archaeology. Kidder felt that it was less cumbersome than a more technical term he might have used. Subsequently, some archaeologists who would try to change the term have worried that because the Pueblo speak different languages, there are different words for ancestor, and using one might be offensive to people speaking other languages. Another of these Pueblo groups are called the Zuni. And the Zuni are also very famous. They have these very special dances that they do, and here's actually one of the oldest images, which was done by the American military. I think it was around the 1850s when they were sort of documenting all the different tribes that they could see, and you can see in the background these huge platform structures that they had with the different hierarchies going all the way up. Very interesting culture if you get the chance to take a look at them. Now they think that Zuni is a Spanish transliteration, Thuñi, that then comes from this word, which is from the Acoma language. Now, Acoma is another one of these Pueblo groups, and that's why Pueblo, the Spanish term for town dweller, is an umbrella term. It's not actually an ethnic group. It's not even a linguistic group, as Cordell described just now in her book. It's actually a conglomeration of people that lived in a similar manner, but were distinct in terms of culture, in terms of language, and I'm pretty sure in terms of genetics as well. So, Acoma, then, we don't actually know what this word Zuni means. It's of an unknown origin, but we know that it's from Acoma. But I thought I should include it because the Zuni are one of the most famous and recognized of the Pueblo groups. Now another is Acoma, and they were famous for their runners. You can see some that were photographed here. They used to run incredible distances. And they think it comes from Acoma, which is the Spanish transliteration. And interestingly enough, this is one of the rare cases where the word Acoma actually comes from a word from the Acoma language itself, because up until now, every tribe in this video and every tribe in the last video have been named by someone outside of their group rather than inside their group, because I was always saying, you know, this is the name that was given to them from this transliteration from Spanish or French or English or whatever, and this is what they called themselves. But the Acoma, interestingly enough, it's from their own word Acoma, and what it means is a person from Acoma Pueblo, so from this town that they had where, you know, where they were living. And that's a very interesting thing, because we don't really see that very often, especially with Native American groups. Now finally, there's another group that are called the Hopi. They are famous for their amazing dances. If you get a chance, look up their different costumes that they wore while dancing. Really intricate, special costumes that they wore and made for themselves, and these dances that still go on today. So if you get a chance to see that, then definitely do. And Hopi, well, it comes from another Hopi word, so this is interesting. It's another case where they've actually managed to get themselves or name themselves. And interestingly enough, the word Hopi means one who behaves, or one who is polite, one who is proper. And they think that this might be in contrast to groups like the Apache and the Navajo, who, while the Navajo did settle down and do farming, you know, the Apache certainly were raiders. They would go off and raid the Spanish and the Pueblo and different groups. And so Hopi was someone from the Pueblo who didn't go off and raid. They were a farmer. It was someone who knew how to behave. So I really like that one, and that's the one I want to end on here, because I thought it was quite nice to do. So let me know if you enjoyed this video. What I'm going to try and do is to have normal videos up each Saturday, and then on Wednesdays alternate between the History with Hilbert podcast and vlogs in clogs, so my various vlogs of me being around and about the place. I've got quite a lot of footage from last summer as well that I'd like to share, things that I recorded when I was in the Netherlands, in Romania, walking around England as well, some things from Cambridge, and now also I've got some footage from Rome and from Copenhagen as well that I'd like to share. as well as just me kind of walking around and talking about different topics that I find interesting. Let me know if you enjoyed this one. I should have another one in the works in a few weeks' time when I'm back home talking about what's happening in Oklahoma, because from a historical perspective, if not getting too political, it is very interesting indeed. But let me know if you enjoyed this one. Give me a thumbs up if you did. Share it around if you think other people would find it interesting. And don't forget to have a great day. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.